The day I realized my backyard had somehow gotten smaller was the day I stopped believing that every neighborhood dispute starts with a misunderstanding. Sometimes it starts with somebody looking you straight in the eye and deciding your property matters less than their convenience. Sometimes it starts with a brand new fence. I had lived in my house for almost 12 years by then, a quiet place on the edge of a small subdivision outside Columbus, Ohio. Nothing fancy. Just a modest white house with a wraparound porch, a couple of old maple trees, and a backyard that stretched farther than most of the lots around me. One of the reasons I bought the place was that open space. The previous owner never liked fences, and honestly neither did I. The yard felt bigger without one. You could stand on the porch in the evening with a cup of coffee and see the sunlight move across the grass all the way to the back property line. For over a decade, nobody questioned where that line was. Nobody had any reason to. Then the house behind mine sold. At first I was happy about it. The old owner had let the place fall apart, and the new buyers seemed energetic. Their names were Derek and Melissa Harper, a young couple probably in their early 30s. They arrived with big plans and even bigger confidence. Within days, contractors were everywhere. New roof, new windows, fresh landscaping, dumpsters coming and going. It looked like one of those home renovation shows where people somehow finish 6 months of work in 2 weekends. I remember standing in my driveway one afternoon talking to my neighbor Frank from across the street. He watched another truck pull up and laughed. Either they're fixing that place up or they're building a theme park. I laughed too. At that point, I had no reason not to like them. The trouble started about 2 weeks later when a fencing company showed up. They unloaded stacks of cedar panels and pressure-treated posts. By the end of the first day, half a privacy fence had already gone up. The next afternoon, it stretched across almost the entire back section of their property. From my kitchen window, something looked off, but I couldn't immediately explain why. It was one of those strange feelings where your eyes keep returning to the same spot. The fence seemed closer than I remembered the property line being. Not dramatically closer, just enough to make me uncomfortable. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, seeing a large structure where there used to be open space can play tricks on your perspective. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, I grabbed a tape measure and walked out to one of the old maple trees near the back corner. That tree had been there longer than any of us. I knew exactly where it sat in relation to the property line because years earlier I had checked my lot dimensions when planning a garden shed. As I measured, my stomach slowly tightened. The distance wasn't what it should have been. I measured again, then a third time. Same result. Somehow nearly 8 feet of my backyard now appeared to be sitting on the other side of Derek's brand new fence. I remember standing there staring at the cedar panels and thinking there had to be a mistake. Surely nobody would intentionally build a fence 8 feet onto someone else's property. So I walked around to their front door. Derek answered wearing work gloves and holding a cordless drill. I kept things friendly. "Hey, Derek, I think there might be an issue with the fence placement." He looked confused for about half a second. "What kind of issue?" I explained what I had measured. I told him the fence seemed farther inside my property than it should be. He shrugged almost immediately. The contractor followed the survey stakes. "Can I see the survey?" I asked. "I don't have it with me," he said. But the contractor knows what he's doing. His answer wasn't rude exactly, but there was something dismissive about it. Like the discussion was already over. I tried again. Maybe it'd be worth double-checking before they finish everything. He smiled. Not a friendly smile. More the kind people give when they're humoring somebody they don't take seriously. "The job's already paid for. Besides, the fence looks great where it is." That sentence stuck with me. The fence looks great where it is. Not, let's verify the measurements. Not, let's make sure nobody made a mistake. Just that it looked good. I walked home with an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. Later that evening, I told Frank what had happened. He leaned against my porch railing and listened quietly. When I finished, he nodded once. "You know what I'd do." "What's that?" "Get a survey. Don't argue. Don't guess. Get proof." Looking back, that was probably the best advice anyone gave me during the entire situation. Because 2 days later, a licensed surveyor arrived at my property, and before that week was over, Derek Harper was about to discover that some people mistake kindness for weakness right up until the moment they run into someone who's done asking nicely. The surveyor arrived early on a Thursday morning, carrying more equipment than I expected. He spent nearly 4 hours walking the property, taking measurements, checking records, and marking reference points. I mostly stayed out of his way, watching from the porch while pretending to read emails on my phone. The truth was I was nervous. Part of me still hoped I was wrong. Not because I wanted to lose 8 feet of land, but because life is simpler when your neighbors aren't trying to take something that belongs to you. Around lunchtime, the surveyor finally walked back toward the house holding a clipboard. Before he even spoke, I could tell from his expression that something wasn't right. "Well," he said, glancing toward the fence behind us, "you're not imagining things." Then he handed me a copy of the preliminary measurements. According to his calculations, the entire fence line sat approximately 8 feet inside my property boundary. Not 6 inches, not a foot, 8 full feet, along nearly the entire width of the yard. I looked back toward the cedar fence, and suddenly it seemed bigger than ever. The surveyor placed bright orange markers along the actual property line. It was almost comical. Every single flag stood well inside Derek and Melissa's newly enclosed backyard. From a distance, it looked like a row of warning lights running straight through the middle of their landscaping project. The surveyor shook his head. Somebody either ignored the survey stakes or never checked them in the first place. I thanked him, paid the invoice, and took photographs from every angle imaginable. That evening I sent Derek a polite email. I attached the survey report, the photographs, and a short note explaining that the fence would need to be relocated. I even made sure the wording stayed professional. No accusations. No threats. Just facts. Then I waited. 1 day passed. Then 2. Then 4. No response. Not even an acknowledgement. A week later, I walked to their house again. Melissa answered the door this time. She glanced at me, immediately recognized why I was there, and called for Derek. He stepped into the doorway looking irritated before I even opened my mouth. "Did you get my email?" I asked. "Yeah." "And?" He folded his arms. "Moving that fence is going to cost thousands of dollars." I blinked. That wasn't exactly a denial. In fact, it sounded suspiciously like an admission. "So you're saying the survey is correct?" He hesitated for a second. "I'm saying the fence is already built. On my property." Another pause. "You still have plenty of yard." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. "What?" He shrugged. "It's 8 feet. You still have a huge backyard." I remember staring at him, trying to understand how someone could say that with a straight face. Imagine borrowing your neighbor's truck without asking and then telling him he owns another vehicle, so it shouldn't matter. The logic was unbelievable. "Are you seriously suggesting I just give you part of my land?" I asked. He let out a small laugh. "Fences end up a little off sometimes." Then he stepped backward and closed the door. Just like that. Conversation over. I stood there for several seconds looking at the door before walking back home. I wasn't angry yet. Not exactly. What I felt was something colder. Disappointment. Until that moment, I had genuinely believed we would solve the issue like adults. Now I realized something important. Derek wasn't refusing because he thought he was right. He was refusing because fixing the mistake would cost money, and he had decided that cost should become my problem instead of his. That realization changed everything. I stopped knocking on doors. I stopped sending emails. I stopped trying to convince him. Instead, I started reading. Property records, easement documents, local zoning ordinances, county regulations. The more I researched, the more interesting the situation became. The fence might physically sit on my land, but legally that land was still mine. Ownership had never changed, which meant something very important. I retained the right to use it. Every square foot of it. One evening while reviewing county maps at my dining room table, an idea started forming in my head. At first it seemed ridiculous. Then it seemed funny. Then it seemed perfect. A few days later I called a landscaping contractor named Raymond, a guy I'd worked with years earlier when installing drainage behind my garage. We met in the backyard. I showed him the survey markers. He listened carefully. Then a slow grin spread across his face. "So let me get this straight," he said. "That fence is on your property. According to the survey, yes. And you want to improve your property?" "Exactly." He laughed. "I think I can help." The following Monday morning, a small excavator rolled into my driveway. A flatbed truck followed behind carrying steel posts, concrete forms, lumber, and several pallets of materials. The moment the equipment arrived, I noticed movement behind the fence. A few minutes later, Derek appeared on his deck. He stood there watching the activity with obvious concern. By lunchtime, he finally walked around and approached the crew. "What's going on?" he demanded. Raymond glanced toward me. I stepped forward. "I'm making improvements on my property." Derek pointed toward the fence. "Inside my backyard?" Actually, I replied, pointing toward the orange survey markers inside my property. His eyes followed my finger. For the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't have an immediate response. The crew began digging holes along the disputed strip, one after another, perfectly spaced, deep enough to anchor heavy support posts. Concrete trucks arrived later that afternoon. By sunset, 6 steel posts stood upright in fresh concrete. The next day, 6 more went in. Derek spent most of those 2 days watching from a distance. Melissa joined him several times. Neither one looked happy. A couple of neighbors wandered over to ask what was happening. Frank nearly choked laughing when he realized where the posts were being installed. "This is either genius," he said quietly, "or the beginning of a war." Maybe it was both. By the end of the second day, 12 steel posts stretched across the entire length of the disputed area. Strong, permanent, impossible to ignore. Yet they still had no idea what I was building. Honestly, that was my favorite part. Every time Derek looked over the fence, he seemed more confused. One afternoon he finally shouted from his deck, "What exactly is that supposed to be?" I smiled and shouted back, "You'll see." The truth was there wasn't going to be a shed, or a gazebo, or a workshop. What I had planned was much simpler, much cheaper, and far more effective. 2 days later, Raymond's crew returned carrying large custom-built planter boxes. Massive wooden containers nearly 4 feet tall and several feet wide. They secured them between the steel supports, filled them with rich soil, installed irrigation lines, and planted something very specific. Something known for growing fast, growing tall, and creating an almost impenetrable wall of greenery. As the workers packed up their equipment, Raymond stepped beside me and admired the finished installation. The first shoots looked harmless enough, almost decorative, but we both knew what those plants would become. "How long?" I asked. He smiled. "Give it a few months." Then he climbed into his truck and drove away. I stood there looking at the newly planted row stretching across my property while sunlight drifted through the fence slats behind it. On the other side, Derek was staring at the planters with growing concern. He still didn't understand why those boxes were there. But soon he would. And when the bamboo reached its full height, the backyard he had tried so hard to steal was about to become the one place he no longer wanted to spend time. At first, nothing happened. For a few weeks, the planter boxes just sat there along the property line, looking like an unusually ambitious landscaping project. A few neighbors asked what I was growing. I usually smiled and said, "Patience." Then summer arrived, and the bamboo did exactly what bamboo is famous for doing. It exploded. Every week it seemed taller. Every week it grew thicker. New shoots pushed upward through the soil with incredible speed, turning what had started as a row of decorative planters into a dense green barrier. By midsummer, some sections were already taller than the fence itself. By early fall, the bamboo stood nearly 8 feet high, forming a solid wall of leaves and stalks that stretched across the entire disputed strip. The transformation was remarkable. From my side, it looked beautiful. Green, private, peaceful. From Derek's side, well, that was a different story. His brand new deck, the one he had spent thousands building, now faced a wall of bamboo instead of an open view. The afternoon sunlight that used to flood his patio disappeared behind a curtain of greenery. Parts of his expensive landscaping remained in shade for most of the day. Every time I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee, I could practically feel his frustration radiating through the fence. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had wanted more privacy. He had certainly gotten it. One Saturday morning, several months after the bamboo was planted, I heard a knock on my front door. When I opened it, Derek was standing there. The difference in his attitude was impossible to miss. Gone was the smug confidence. Gone was the dismissive shrug. He looked tired, frustrated, maybe even a little embarrassed. "Can we talk?" he asked. I invited him onto the porch. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then he nodded toward the backyard. "The bamboo is getting out of control." I took a sip of coffee. "Seems healthy to me." He sighed. "You know what I mean." "I probably do." Another long silence followed. Finally, he said the words I had been waiting months to hear. "The fence shouldn't have been built there." I leaned back in my chair. "No, it shouldn't have." He rubbed the back of his neck and looked down at the porch floor. "Would you consider removing the bamboo?" I thought about all the conversations that had led to this moment. The ignored email, the survey report, the closed door, the comment about how I still had plenty of yard. Then I gave him the same thing he had never been willing to give me in the beginning, a reasonable solution. Sure, I said. Move the fence. He looked up immediately. That's it. That's always been it. For the first time since this mess started, there wasn't really an argument. There wasn't much he could say. He knew he was wrong. More importantly, he finally understood that ignoring the problem had cost far more than fixing it would have. 2 weeks later, the fencing company returned. I watched from my backyard as workers dismantled panel after panel. The same fence that had appeared so permanent months earlier came apart surprisingly fast. Posts were pulled from the ground. Holes were filled. New measurements were taken. This time, every step followed the survey markers exactly. No shortcuts. No assumptions. No convenient interpretations. When the project was finished, the fence stood where it should have been from the very beginning. 8 feet farther back. Exactly on the legal property line. A few days later, I kept my word. Raymond's crew came back and removed the planter boxes. The bamboo disappeared along with them. Sunlight returned to Derek's yard. His deck opened back up. The shade lifted from his landscaping. And my backyard regained every inch that had always belonged to me. Looking across the grass afterward felt strangely satisfying. Not because I had won, but because the situation never should have become a battle in the first place. The entire conflict could have been solved with a simple conversation and a willingness to admit a mistake. Instead, it became a months-long lesson about property rights, pride, and consequences. Sometimes people think being a good neighbor means avoiding conflict at all costs. I don't agree. I think being a good neighbor means respecting boundaries, literally and figuratively. And when someone refuses to respect yours, you don't always need revenge. Sometimes all you need is patience, documentation, and a perfectly legal way to remind them where the line actually is. Even now, years later, I occasionally see comments online from people debating stories like this. Some say I should have sued immediately. Others say I should have let the 8 feet go because keeping peace is more important. Honestly, I still don't know what the perfect answer is. What I do know is this. If someone tried the same thing again tomorrow, I'd order the survey before I even knocked on their door. But here's the question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. If you discovered your neighbor had taken 8 feet of your property and then told you it wasn't a big deal because you still had plenty left, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have gone even further? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates a little neighborhood karma served with a side of bamboo.